Welcome to Season 5 of the Lest We Forget podcast, a historical podcast by Tenement Yard Media. I'm Gabrielle, your host for this episode. On behalf of the entire Tenement Yard team, thank you so very much for listening. We'd really love to hear from you about this and all our past episodes, and really all happenings around Caribbean history and culture. You know the drill. Follow us on our social media pages at tenementyard_ on both Instagram and Twitter to view additional postings on this episode and updates on other content created by Tenement Yard Media. We're over on Patreon at patreon.com/tenementyardmedia if you'd like to support the show with a monthly donation of as little as $1. But before that, please allow me to do a little celebrating its 5 entire seasons. Here we go. Onto the episode. In this episode, we'll be discussing the salt plantations of the Caribbean. And a quick content warning before we begin. This episode contains discussions around violence, slavery, and wider harm. Most scholarship on Caribbean chattel slavery of enslaved Africans largely covers the sugar and tobacco plantation systems throughout the region. But there was another massive industry that was built upon the enslavement of African people, and that was the cultivation of salt. Throughout the 18th and 19th century, the region was one of the main suppliers of salt to Europe and the United States. To trace the beginning of this industry, which led to many enslaved Africans working on salt plantations in pink saltine water, which were called salt pans, we begin this story with the first inhabitants of the Caribbean region, the Amerindians. There exists limited scholarship and research on the Amerindians and their contribution to the salt industry of the Caribbean. However, there is evidence that exists. St. Martin was called Soaliga, meaning land of salt, by the Arawaks who resided on the island. In one place in particular, the indigenous population understood the importance of salt and were willing to fight for it, and that place was Puerto Rico. In an interview with travel journalist Jennifer Billock for her article, "These Salt Pink Flats in Puerto Rico Are Cotton Candy Pink," University of Puerto Rico biologist Professor Lilian Casillas Martinez explains that the Aracos and Taino population were already producing salt before the arrival of the Europeans. From as early as the 700 Common Era CE, these indigenous populations were utilizing the salt marshes of Cabo Rojo to produce salt. Upon the arrival of the Spanish to the Caribbean, they started to export the salt and enslaved the indigenous population to produce it. Dr. Casillas Martinez explained that eventually the locals went to battle with the Spanish for the salt pans. And today, a beach close to the salt pans where this battle took place is called Combate, which when translated to English means fight. And so it happened that across the region, more Europeans came and exploited salty areas of the territories, but Bermuda and its exploitation of Turks and Caicos became the catalyst of how big the industry would get off the backs of an enslaved population. Bermuda became occupied by Europeans in 1605. By 1609, it was under the control of the Virginia Company. Through colonization by 1625, almost the entire island was dedicated to the cultivation of tobacco. It was around this time that enslaved Africans were brought to the island to foster the growth of this crop. The island underwent rapid growth in its population, and despite leadership implementing a limit on how many slaves were brought to the country, Bermuda became one of the most densely populated English colonies. This overpopulation on the island resulted in immense pressure for migration to take place to other areas in the region. Also around this time, the tobacco production was being challenged by a fall in global prices and even agricultural issues. Still, Bermuda had an advantage in its location as it lay among Europe, Britain, and the United States. The island looked towards another form of income, and that was through seafaring and shipbuilding, and it would be enslaved Africans and free Bermudian males who would make up the work crew. In 1684, the Somers Island Company, which had control over Bermuda, dissolved, and soon after, the island was under the control of the Crown. This major shift in Bermuda's history and the major shift by Somers Island Company's dissolution created even more socio-economic problems on the island. People looked beyond its shores for more opportunities. Some marine workers looked south and soon became interested in the wide-scale cultivation of salt in another English colony, the Turks and Caicos Islands. This marked the beginning of almost 300 years of dependency on salt cultivation for Turks and Caicos. The Turks and Caicos archipelago was perfect really for salt production. The lands were flat, which allowed for the development of salt pans without the interference of hilly terrain. Two areas were favorable though, an island which is known today as Grand Turk and another which would be named Salt Key. Climate also played a major factor. The islands lay on the southernmost end of the Lucayan archipelago, which means a warm climate with low levels of rainfall and continual trade winds which allow for salt deposits to be formed. The Bermudians decided to use this to their advantage. Historian Kimberly Thomas notes that even though the beginning of salt production cannot be given a specific time, the general consensus is that it began around the 1660s. Bermudians used the rocks to create salt pans from the naturally occurring salinas, which are shallow inland areas filled with salt water directly from the sea to create salt pans. Upon the discovery of the lucrative business that could be made from the production of salt, around the late 1600s, a steady migration of Bermudians to the territory began. As Bermuda's economy became even more dependent on maritime activities, migration to Turks and Caicos increased. In his book, Chained on the Rock, Cyril Packwood states that around 500 Bermudians were a part of the salt industry in 1701. When the Queen Anne's War kicked off in 1702, the price of salt increased across the Atlantic and more Bermudians became involved in salt production, specifically salt raking. I should note, however, that this migration was purely seasonal. This is so as initially Bermudians in Turks would return home outside of salt production season. It also did not help that the island had very little water available. At this time, at the beginning of the industry, Turks and Caicos had defense issues. With no form of protection, 4 times in the 18th century, 1706, 1753, 1778, and 1783, the French seized control of Turks. When this happened, white people were captured and eventually released, but enslaved blacks were captured and taken as property. And so, at the beginning of the industry, the persons working in Turks and Caicos were sailors from Bermuda. The salt season in the Caribbean ran from March to November. During this period, the weather is hot and dry, which is the suitable climate to harvest salt. At the beginning of the season, the salt ponds were divided and allocated among white owners. Historian Kimberly Thomas, in her academic paper Beyond the Plantation, Salt, Turks Island, Bermuda and the British Atlantic World, 1660s to 1850s, she outlines the day-to-day production on the salt pans of Turks and Caicos. Here's an excerpt from that paper. Salt gatherers dug out, demarcated and cleaned their salt pans of impurities within the drained lagoons before a series of sluices and gates were opened to allow the seawater back in. As evaporation occurred, concentrated brine was encouraged into shallower pans to augment its surface area and facilitate further evaporation. While the sun and wind did much of the work, this was still exceedingly laborious. It involved standing in concentrated brine for many hours of the day, raking salt and encouraging crystals to form. Once the salt was ready to be harvested, it was piled up on land, covered with palmetto leaves and left to dry, before it was carried by hand in bushel bags onto lighters and transported to merchant ships offshore. In Turk specifically, a salt grinding house on Grand Turk processed the island's salt. By the mid-1700s, the Caribbean was one of the main exporters of salt to Britain and its colonies, and the demand for salt would increase subsequently. This was due to the increase in marine activities in the region and the workers who needed salt for the preservation of food. But most importantly, by this time, more and more enslaved Africans were brought to the Caribbean, and salted protein became their primary diet. Fish was the most popular protein, specifically codfish, which required about 25,000 to 50,000 tons of salt per year. Across the black diaspora, tales found in literature described the existence of flying Africans, where black slaves were rumored to be fed salt to prevent flight. As such, white gold was the term that historians and other social scientists gave to salt, and for good reason, as alongside sugar, it became one of the major exports out of the region. In his article White Gold, How Salt Made and Unmade the Turks and Caicos Islands, Welsh historian Mike Dash states, quote, "By 1772, in the last years before the American War of Independence, Britain's North American colonies were importing 660,000 bushels annually from the West Indies, nearly 40 million pounds of white gold," end quote. Then the late 1770s brought two events that would impact the territory's salt production. The first was the U.S. Revolution. The event led to many English people and those loyal to England leaving the United States and settling in the Caribbean with their slaves. One of these places they settled in were the Turks Islands, where the English granted them land as claims of the war. This caused an increase in persons being more invested in the salt industry and propelling said industry with cheap labor, enslaved blacks, and I'll get to that in a bit. The revolution also brought an increase in the demand for salt. There were numerous reports of U.S. vessels carrying salt being seized. After the war ended in 1783, the U.S. reduced imports on salt and opted to develop domestic salt production sites. Another issue was the passing of the hands of governance over the Turks Islands. During the decade, conflict erupted between Bermuda and the Bahamas, where the latter wanted full control over the jurisdiction over the Turks Islands. And with this decision, the Bahamas, now a crown colony, enacted two conditions on those who took part in Turks' salt industry. Condition 1 stipulated that persons had to reside on the island permanently and not just for the 9 to 10 months which the salt season took place. Condition 2 said any enslaved people who missed more than 2 days of work during a 10-month period would forfeit their owner's profit. These two acts were to affect Bermuda's control over the salt industry, and Bermudians realized this. When they argued against the Bahamas' control over the island, one of their main points was that the Turks Island lay outside of the Bahamas' jurisdiction. Another point they brought across, the Turks Islands were way easier to reach from Bermuda than from the Bahamas. This argument, however, did not sway the powers that were, and that was when Bermudians decided to take matters into their own hands. While on the island, a Bahamian tax officer was beaten by a group of salt rakers. Then in 1774, Bermuda sent a group of armed persons to defend Turks and Caicos. And this was really nothing new. As mentioned before, the islands were prone to attacks, but this time it was not the French, but Bahamians as well. Historian Mike Dash makes note that it was the U.S. Revolution and the attention given to it by the Western world that prevented any full-blown war between Bermuda and the Bahamas. Despite Bermuda fighting to have a stronghold over the Turks and Caicos, it was not enough. In 1803, a resolution in the British Parliament to prevent any war and its consequences between the two territories officially transferred control of Turks and Caicos to the Bahamas. This hostility between the two countries would last for decades. So intense was the hatred, in the mid-1800s, persons on the Turks Islands pleaded with authorities to release them from Bahamian rule. The residents argued that the Bahamian Authority had done nothing to develop the island and that the island was only being exploited. Relenting to the residents' pleas, beginning in 1848, Turks and Caicos was ruled from Jamaica, and this lasted right up to Jamaica's independence in 1962. In that same year, there was a brief union between the Bahamas and the Turks and Caicos. Still, the generational hostility did not let up, and in 1974, the two territories separated. But speaking of Jamaica, it seems right to now mention the other salt pans across the region. For those in Turks and Caicos, although they dominated the market, the Bahamas and Puerto Rico, they were not the only ones. First up was Jamaica. In the book Jamaica Place Names by B.W. Higman and B.J. Hudson, two salt pans were mentioned: the Great Salt Pond in St. Catherine and the Salt Pond in St. Thomas. In the book Salt in Eastern North America and the Caribbean, History and Archaeology, edited by Ian W. Brown and Ann M. Early, salt specialist and nutritionist Alyssa Sperry states the following: there are also other locations on the southern coast that contain salt in their names, such as Salt Savannah, Salt River Bay, Salt Island Lagoon, and the Salt Island Creek, suggesting that these places were known sources of salt and might have been involved in Jamaica's salt industry. Land titles and maps also outline that from as early as 1668, a Captain John Knott owned a salt-making facility at the Great Salt Pond. Copies of these maps can be found in the Jamaica Archives and Records Unit. In his book History of Jamaica, Williams James Gardner noted that Captain Knott produced 10,000 bushels of salt in 1670. Alyssa Sperry says that this is the equivalent to almost 50 to 70,000 pounds of salt each year from the salt pond. Williams James Gardner says that Salt Lagoon was not a natural salt pond but was engineered by a governor of Jamaica, Sir Thomas Modiford. He states that Modiford was invested in salt alongside sugar, being a major stream of income for Jamaica and its white population. But the plantation system of Jamaica surrounded sugar, and it was there that the focus of exploitation on the island was spotlighted, and so whatever dreams that Modiford and Knott had would eventually never really materialize. In Haiti, the French utilized the salty marshes at the mouth of the Artibonite River, the longest river in Haiti and the longest on the island of Hispaniola. According to Steve Coupeau in his book The History of Haiti, the French named the area Grande Saline, which translates to the Great Salt Works in English. The salt produced was used to barter with the English for other goods throughout the 1700s. Still, like other colonies in the region, as mentioned before, salt was used to prepare protein, mostly salted fish, for enslaved blacks. In Haiti, salt also served another important purpose. According to Katie Bernard in her 2013 article The Poetics of Salt Journey, A Taste of Salt, there existed a relationship between salt and Haitian voodoo. Salt is used to awaken zombies during ceremonies. That is termed goutte sel in Haitian Creole, which translates roughly to taste of salt in English. Zombies, it is said, do not taste, and so during goutte sel, the salt is used to awaken them, and through this, A zombie is reminded that it is no longer among the living and is released from being a living dead. Another ceremony is Veve. Veve is used to invite the presence of divine spirits, Loa, as they are termed in Haiti. Veve is conducted before any sacred voodoo ceremony, and even though some people use cornmeal or ash, salt is also used by many. Salt has been used in cleansing rituals for years, not only by Haitians and other enslaved people in the Caribbean, but black enslaved people in the United States. These cleansing rituals are still practiced across the African diaspora today. But back to the salt pans we go. In the Eastern Caribbean, there was salt production in Barbuda. In her 1981 academic dissertation, A History of Barbuda under the Codringtons, 1738 to 1833, historian Margaret T. Tweedy makes note of salt flashes that existed on the island. Unlike pans, flashes are bodies of water that develop when the land has subsided. To this, Tweedy states, quote, Colonel King, as usual, had suggestions to make. He wrote in 1740 that there were a great number of salt flashes in Barbuda, from which great quantities of salt might be annually made, which sells here. There is no evidence to suggest that this idea was developed at all until the late 18th century, and then to any remarkable extent. In the accounts throughout the period 1785 to 1814, salt was sold frequently, but in small quantities to the estates, and less frequently on the general market. End quote. In Anguilla, the salt pans were exploited by the Dutch who arrived in 1624. When they arrived, they utilized the island's 17 salt ponds and the 240 acres of salt along Road Salt Pond. This production of salt in Anguilla lasted for almost 300 years, where almost 90,000 bushels of salt were produced annually. On the island of St. Christopher, more popularly known as St. Kitts, salt production took place in an area now called the Salt Ponds. By the late 1600s, salt became one of the main commodities that fostered trade on the island. According to the St. Kitts National Archives, in 1693 and 1694, when the British had control of the area, Deputy Governor Thomas Hill infuriated the Nevis Council as he only allowed certain people to produce salt from the ponds. An 1854 documentation by John Davy on St. Kitts' Salt Pond states the following. The people employed have half of what they collect for their labor, or rather the price of half, for it is bought on account of the estates to which the lake belongs. Thus, if the price of the basket is fixed at 3 pence, 3 is fixed for each basket. In some years immense quantities have been obtained, and the laborer has made as much as $12 a week. The salt is sold chiefly to the Americans. In 1624, when the Dutch arrived in St. Martin, they came in contact with the island's great salt pond. This discovery was of great interest for the Dutch. According to historians Rod Stelton and Conrad Angstel in their paper, Life at the Salty Edge of Empire, the maritime landscape at the Orange Salt Pan on Bonaire, 1821 to 1960, the Dutch were, quote, forced to find sources of salt other than Portugal during the 80 Years' War, end quote. Once they came to the Caribbean, just like every other colonizer of the region, the Dutch started mass production of salt in the area. At the height of this exploitation, the Dutch shipped 400 ships loaded with salt throughout the region and the rest of the world. On the northern section of the island, the French territory of St. Martin, the French produced salt primarily around the salt pond in Grand Casse. The Dutch were also gathering salt from a beach off the coast of Venezuela, where on a nearby island off the coast of Venezuela called Salt Tortuga, the British were gathering salt. But it was the Dutch Antilles where salt production was profound, primarily on the island of Bonaire. As a matter of fact, Bonaire became the center of the Dutch salt trade in the Caribbean region. their dependency on the white gold rivals that of Turks and Caicos. The island was first inhabited by indigenous people known as Caicos before European arrival. In the paper Profitable on an Unprofitable Island, Resources and Gatekeepers on Bonaire, academic Ankh Klomp states that in the beginning of European colonization, the Spanish labeled the islands of Aruba, Bonaire and Curacao as Islas Inútil. This roughly translates to useless, unprofitable islands because precious metals were not found there. There was also the issue where the lack of frequent rainfall made cultivation difficult, and so by the time the Dutch arrived and even sometime after they came, Bonaire was used to supply goat meat to Curacao, which at this point was acting as the commercial events center of the Caribbean. By 1620, only 40 persons lived in Bonaire. The Dutch eventually took control of Bonaire in 1636, and the island was left in the control of the Dutch West India Company WIC. And so it began. The Dutch built established salt pans across Bonaire throughout the century and the next. A few included the orange pans, the white pans, and the blue pans. Historian Stelton and Angstel stated that the orange pan alone was estimated to produce 50,000 to 70,000 barrels of salt per year. Ironically, however, this salt was sold to the United States as the Dutch considered the quality of the salt inferior. Still, production increased greatly throughout the 1700s and 1800s, and this was due to the enslavement of Africans. As a matter of fact, the entire salt industry of the Caribbean was built off the backs of enslaved blacks. Literally. Even though many slaves fled to Haiti, where by 1804 the country achieved independence, becoming the world's first black republic, and where all black persons were free, across the Caribbean, the life of these enslaved people working on salt pans have been documented in various ways. In Bonaire, still today, one can see the yellow huts where the island's salt pan enslaved population lived. In Philipsburg, the capital of St. Martin, there exists the Salt Pickers Monument. The public statue consists of 5 separate bronze statues, a man with a shovel, 2 women gathering salt in one place, and another man and woman carrying a large tray of salt. As of the recording of this episode, the man with the shovel is no longer part of the monument due to damages caused by hurricanes and road incidents. In Jamaica, a sketch created by English artist William Berryman, which is now housed at the National Archives and Records Unit, depicts the day-to-day activities on Jamaica's salt pans. Salt expert Alyssa Sperry says that this art piece might have been completed somewhere between 1806 and 1816. In the drawing, a building is seen surrounded by several salt pans where enslaved people were drawn working there. Most notably in the painting were enslaved women working on these salt pans, which, alongside the monument of women enslaved in St. Martin, previously mentioned, further highlights the role black women played in the production of salt in the colonial Caribbean. Still, the role of women in the salt production process is not only seen in Jamaica. As such, it should come as no surprise that it would be an enslaved woman who would depict the life of slaves working on Caribbean salt pans. Mary Prince's autobiography, The History of Mary Prince, a West Indian Slave, is not only a comprehensive look at the life of an enslaved person working on Turks and Caicos' salt pans, but the book is one of the few slave narratives to come out of the Caribbean. Mary Prince was born in Bermuda around 1788 to an enslaved black man in the household of Charles Miners and a father who was a shipbuilder's sawyer. As a child, she was sold with her mother to Darrell Williams, who gave her as a gift to his granddaughter. Prince served as a childhood companion to the granddaughter until age 12, when she was hired out as a nurse to a neighboring household. After the death of Williams's wife, he sold Prince to another slave owner in Spanish Point, Bermuda. After working on the salt ponds of Turks and Caicos for about 10 years, she would return to Bermuda, where soon after she was sold to John Wood in Antigua. Then in 1817, Prince joined the local Moravian church where she met her future husband, a free carpenter and cooper named Daniel James, whom she married in December of 1826. Prince accompanied John Woods to England in 1828, where she worked for the Wood family for a few months. Soon after, she left their household and consulted with a local anti-slavery society for her freedom. When Wood refused to sell Prince her freedom, which would allow her to return to her family in Antigua without being re-enslaved, the Anti-Slavery Society petitioned Parliament in June 1829 to compel Wood to grant her manumission. The petition was neutralized, however, by Wood's departure for Antigua before it was brought to public hearing. Almost a year later, Prince was in London and entered the household of Thomas Pringle as a free domestic servant. While with the Pringles, she told her life story to Susanna Moody, a writer and member of the London anti-slavery movement. The result produced the book The History of Mary Prince, a West Indian Slave, published in 1831. It was the first account of a black woman's life to ever be published in England. In the book, Mary Prince speaks on the period of her life as a slave on Turks and Caicos Islands, where the territory fell under Bahamian slave laws. Here is an excerpt of that account. I was immediately sent to work in the salt water with the rest of the slaves. This work was perfectly new to me. I was given a half barrel and a shovel and had to stand up to my knees in the water from 4 o'clock in the morning till 9, when we were given some Indian corn boiled in water, which we were obliged to swallow as fast as we could, for fear the rain should come on and melt the salt. We were then called again to our tasks and worked throughout the heat of the day, the sun flaming upon our heads like fire and raising salt blisters in those parts which were not completely covered. Our feet and legs, from standing in the salt water for so many hours, soon became full of dreadful boils, which eat down in some cases to the very bone, afflicting the sufferers with great torment. We came home at 12, ate our corn soup called blawly as fast as we could, and went back to our employment till dark at night. We then shoveled up the salt in large heaps and went down to the sea, where we washed the pickle from our limbs and cleaned the barrows and shovels from the salt. When we returned to the house, our master gave us each our allowance of raw Indian corn, which we pounded in a mortar and boiled in water for our suppers. We slept in a long shed divided into narrow slips like the stalls used for cattle. Boards fixed upon stakes driven into the ground without mat or covering were our only beds. On Sundays, after we had washed the salt bags and done other work required of us, we went into the bush and cut the long soft grass, of which we made trusses for our legs and feet to rest upon, for they were so full of the salt boils that we would get no rest lying upon the bare boards. Though we worked from morning till night, there was no satisfying Mr. D. I hoped when I left Captain that I should have been better off, but I found it was but going from one butcher to another. There was this difference between them. My former master used to beat me while raging and foaming with passion. Mr. D was usually quite calm. He would stand by and give orders for a slave to be cruelly whipped and assist in the punishment without moving a muscle of his face, walking about and taking snuff with the greatest composure. Nothing could touch his hard heart, neither sighs, nor tears, nor prayer, nor streaming blood. He was deaf to our cries and careless of our sufferings. Mr. D has often stripped me naked, hung me up by the wrists, and beat me with the cowskin with his own hand till my body was raw with gashes. Yet there was nothing very remarkable in this, for it might serve as a sample of the common usage of the slaves on that horrible island. Owing to the boils in my feet, I was unable to wheel the barrow fast through the sand, which got into the sores and made me stumble at every step. And my master, having no pity for my sufferings from this cause, rendered them far more intolerable by chastising me for not being able to move so fast as he wished me. Another of our employments was to row a little way off from the shore in a boat and dive for large stones to build a wall round our master's house. This was very hard work, and the great waves breaking over us continually made us often so giddy that we lost our footing, and we were in danger of being drowned. When we were ill, let our complaint be what it might, the only medicine given to us was a great bowl of hot salt water with salt mixed with it, which made us very sick. If we could not keep up with the rest of the gang of slaves, we were put in the stocks and severely flogged the next morning. Yet not the less our master expected, after we had thus been kept from our rest, and our limbs rendered stiff and sore from ill usage, that we should still go through the ordinary tasks of the day all the same. Sometimes we had to work all night, measuring salt to load a vessel, or turning a machine to draw water out of the sea for the salt making. Then we had no sleep, no rest, but we were forced to work as fast as we could and go on again all next day the same as usual. Work, work, work. Oh, that Turk's Island was a terrible place. The people in England, I am sure, have never found out what is carried on there. Cruel, horrible place. One thing not mentioned here, though, is that in the first edition of the book, the editor made note that Mary Prince had issues with her eyesight, which had gotten worse and eventually led to blindness. Many enslaved persons working on salt pans, like Mary, had issues with their eyesight and became blind, and this could be because of the ores being exposed in the sun's heat and staring at the white surface of the sand. Still, it would pass. The people of England now had a first-hand account of not only salt pan slaves but the reality of enslaved people in different industries across the region. The book was so popular that 3 editions of it were published throughout 1831. It not only intensified the fight for ending slavery across British colonies, but Mary Prince, through her words, contributed greatly to the passing of the Slavery Abolition Act in August 1833. Almost a year later, on August 1, 1834, enslaved people in the British West Indies were formally declared free through an apprenticeship system. The apprenticeship system was unpopular among former slaves and other members of society, and it was not implemented in Trinidad. Still, Bermuda freed their slaves immediately, as well as Antigua, making Antigua the only sugar-producing British colony to transition directly to emancipation. Almost 4 years later, full freedom was granted to all enslaved blacks on August 1, 1838, across British colonies. In 2012, Mary Prince was inducted as a National Hero of Bermuda. In the years after the emancipation in the British West Indies, salt production in the region dropped. White slave owners did not have responsibility over the care of the enslaved and no longer had any need for salted protein to feed them. In the Dutch West Indies, slavery was abolished on July 1, 1863. Then there were the establishment of other markets. By the late 1800s, the price of salt decreased and it became cheaper to import salt from Venezuela than produce it locally. As the years progressed, colonial salt-producing Caribbean countries would center their economy around tourism, and the salt production fell to the side. The legacy of salt in the Caribbean is still seen today. Despite the decline of salt production in the region, there are a couple salt-making facilities. In 1969, the Industrial Chemical Company ICC built a number of factories in St. Catherine, Jamaica, and soon after became the only salt-producing company on the island. The company manufactures salt using salt water and also chemicals. In 2015, the Development Bank of Jamaica gave a $2 million investment for ICC to expand their operation and increase their exports by 30 to 40%. A September 2015 newspaper article from the Jamaica Observer noted that the ICC controlled 80% of the local market. In Turks and Caicos, the Salt Key is home of the island's sole export industry. According to the Salt Key Salt Works' website, the salt produced is used to make bath salts, culinary salt, and the premier cooking salt, fleur de sel. For many years since the 1870s, the Turks and Caicos flag featured 2 piles of salt awaiting loading onto a freighter. And funny enough, while being approved in England, someone drew a door onto one of the salt piles thinking it was an igloo. It was decades later in the 1960s that the error was corrected. In Barbuda, there exist small-scale businesses that produce salt. In Bonaire, the solar salt facility owned by the US-based company Cargill is one of the largest in the Caribbean, where the facility covers about 13% of the island. The facility also serves as a popular site for visitors with its striking pink waters and white pyramids, which are roughly 50 feet high and contain an estimated 10,000 tons of 99.6% pure salt. At its height of production each year, there exist 200,000 tons of salt prepared for export. The facility also houses the largest pink flamingo sanctuary in North America. But the legacy of salt extends to West Indians' view and consumption of food today. As I said before, salted protein, with the most popular being salted codfish, became the primary diet of enslaved people in the Caribbean region. This diet of salted cod is a staple across the region, and interestingly enough, the closest cod fishery facility is almost 2,000 miles north of the region. There's the popular saltfish cakes in Barbados, saltfish buljol in Trinidad and Tobago, and bacon saltfish in Guyana. The national dish of St. Lucia is green fig and saltfish, where likewise in Jamaica the national dish is ackee and saltfish. And bear in mind, this is just a few Caribbean nations. There is something to be said about the region's production of condiments and how that history manifests itself in bodies. The Caribbean region has produced and consumed sugar for centuries. Today we have one of the highest diabetes rates in the world. According to the Caribbean Public Health Agency CARPHA, the Caribbean region has the highest prevalence of raised blood pressure in the Americas, from a high of 27.1% to a low of 20.9%. We probably should have called this episode Salt, Colonialism and its Effects, cause isn't that something?